Imagine you're 8 years old, dressed in fine velvet, living in a palace surrounded by luxury most children could never dream of. You share lessons with the prince, eat at royal tables, and sleep in chambers warmed by roaring fires. You are, by all appearances, living a fairy tale life of privilege and comfort. Now imagine that every single day you wake up knowing that if your royal companion makes even the smallest mistake, if he stumbles over a Latin conjugation, speaks out of turn, or shows disrespect to his tutors, you will be dragged from the room and brutally beaten while he watches. Your screams will echo through marble corridors as leather straps tear into your flesh, all because a boy born with royal blood cannot be touched. But you can. This was the reality of the whipping boy, one of history's most psychologically twisted institutions. These weren't servants or peasants chosen at random. They were carefully selected noble children, often from families desperate for royal favor, who became living sacrificial lambs in the grand theater of royal education. Their existence reveals something profoundly disturbing about how power operates when it becomes so absolute that it transforms childhood friendship into a relationship built on vicarious suffering. The whipping boy system flourished in European courts from the 15th through the 17th centuries, reaching its most refined cruelty in the courts of England and France. These children lived in a psychological hell that modern minds can barely comprehend, forming genuine bonds with their royal charges while knowing that love would inevitably lead to pain. Their story isn't just a footnote in royal history, it's a window into the absolutely dehumanizing nature of divine monarchy, where even children became instruments of political control. Today, we're going to explore the lived experience of these forgotten victims, children whose names history barely remembers, but whose suffering helped shape the most powerful rulers in European history. Their tragedy exposes the brutal machinery that operated behind the gilded facades of royal courts. To understand the whipping boy system, we must first grasp the theological and political foundations that made it seem not just acceptable, but necessary to medieval and early modern minds. European monarchs weren't simply political leaders, they were considered God's representatives on earth, chosen by divine will to rule over lesser mortals. This doctrine of the divine right of kings created an impossible problem. How do you discipline a child who is literally untouchable? The medieval mind operated on the principle that striking a royal person was tantamount to striking God himself. Even a tutor's gentle rap across the knuckles could be interpreted as treason, punishable by death. Yet royal children, like all children, needed discipline to become effective rulers. The solution that emerged was as ingenious as it was cruel. Find another child to absorb the punishment while the prince watched and learned. The selection process for whipping boys was methodical and calculating. Courts didn't choose random peasant children. They needed boys from noble families who could serve as appropriate companions for princes. These children had to be intelligent enough to share advanced lessons, well-mannered enough for court life, and psychologically resilient enough to endure regular beatings without breaking completely. Most importantly, they needed to form genuine emotional bonds with their royal charges, making the punishment meaningful. The twisted logic was that a prince who loved his whipping boy would suffer psychologically when his companion was beaten for the prince's mistakes. Theoretically, this would create more effective discipline than physical punishment ever could. The prince would learn that his actions had consequences for those he cared about, a lesson deemed essential for future rulers who would hold the lives of millions in their hands. Royal tutors were given explicit instructions on how to implement this system. When a prince misbehaved, the tutor would solemnly explain the transgression, then summon guards to remove the whipping boy to a separate chamber. The beating had to occur within earshot of the prince, but out of direct sight, creating maximum psychological impact while maintaining the fiction that royal eyes shouldn't witness such violence. The screams and pleas of the whipping boy were considered an essential part of the prince's education. The families who provided these children often saw it as an opportunity rather than a curse. Having a son serve as a royal whipping boy guaranteed access to the highest levels of court society, potential advancement for the entire family, and the possibility that their child might grow up to become a trusted advisor to the future king. Many parents convinced themselves they were giving their sons the chance of a lifetime, even as they condemned them to years of systematic abuse. The psychological preparation of whipping boys was elaborate and deliberate. They were taught from an early age that their suffering served a noble purpose, that they were sacrificing their bodies for the good of the realm. Religious instruction emphasized martyrdom and the virtue of suffering for others. They were told they were honored above other children, chosen for a sacred duty that would ultimately benefit all of Christendom. The morning routine in a royal household with a whipping boy was a carefully choreographed dance of potential violence. Picture young William Murray, whipping boy to the future King Charles III, waking before dawn in his small but comfortable chamber adjacent to the prince's quarters. The stone walls around him were hung with tapestries depicting biblical scenes of sacrifice and suffering, a daily reminder of his role. The cold morning air carried the scent of wood smoke from the servants' fires and the distant aroma of fresh bread from the kitchens. Normal, comforting smells that must have felt like mockery to a child who knew that breakfast might be interrupted by a beating. William would dress in clothes nearly as fine as the prince's own, silk stockings, velvet doublets, and soft leather shoes that marked his elevated status among the servants. Yet beneath these luxurious garments, his body bore the permanent marks of his position, welts across his back that never fully healed, bruises in various stages of recovery, and the peculiar stiffness that comes from muscles constantly tensed in anticipation of pain. His fingers would tremble slightly as he fastened his buttons, not from the cold, but from the anxiety that began each day with the simple question, what would the prince do wrong today? The educational sessions took place in the Great Hall or the prince's private study, rooms filled with the warm light of tall windows and the scratch of quills on parchment. The tutors, learned men in long robes who commanded respect from everyone except their royal pupil, would arrange lessons in Latin, mathematics, geography, and statecraft. William would sit beside Prince Charles, sharing the same books, working through the same problems, forming the kind of intellectual partnership that should have been the foundation of lifelong friendship. But beneath the surface of normal boyhood learning lurked a constant tension that poisoned every interaction. When Charles stumbled over a passage from Virgil, William's stomach would clench with dread. When the prince showed impatience with a mathematical problem, William would feel sweat break out on his palms. The tutor's facial expressions became a language of terror. A slight frown might mean safety, but a pursed lip or disappointed sigh could signal the end of William's peaceful morning. The moment of punishment followed a ritual as formal as a court ceremony. The tutor would set down his materials with deliberate precision, the sound of books closing echoing through the suddenly silent chamber. "Your Highness," he would say in carefully measured tones, "your companion must now receive instruction on your behalf." The prince would be required to remain seated, forbidden from intervening but compelled to witness the consequences of his behavior. Guards would enter, not the gentle palace servants, but stern men whose faces betrayed no emotion as they grasped William's arms. The beating chamber was typically a small room adjacent to the study, close enough that every sound would carry clearly to the prince's ears. The walls were bare stone, easier to clean afterward, and furnished only with a wooden bench and the implements of punishment, leather straps, birch rods, and occasionally the dreaded cat-o'-nine tails for serious transgressions. The air in this room always carried the metallic tang of old blood and the sharp scent of leather, smells that would trigger panic in William's mind for the rest of his life. The physical pain was only part of William's torment. As the leather bit into his flesh, he could hear Prince Charles through the wall, sometimes crying, sometimes shouting for the beating to stop, sometimes maintaining the stoic silence he'd been taught was proper for royalty. Each of the prince's reactions cut into William's psyche differently. The tears meant Charles cared, which made the pain somehow more bearable, but also more confusing. The silence was worse. It suggested that perhaps William's suffering didn't matter, that he truly was nothing more than an object to be used and discarded. The aftermath of these sessions created an emotional minefield that both boys had to navigate carefully. Charles would often try to comfort his whipping boy afterward, bringing him sweet treats from the kitchens or sharing his own toys and books. These gestures of kindness were simultaneously genuine expressions of affection and desperate attempts to assuage guilt. William would accept them graciously, even as part of his mind wondered whether the prince's remorse was worth the agony he'd just endured. The psychological bond between whipping boy and prince was unlike anything else in the rigid hierarchy of court life. They shared secrets, fears, and dreams in a way that transcended their official roles. William knew Charles's weaknesses better than anyone: his fear of his stern father, King James, his struggles with stuttering, his loneliness in a world where genuine friendship was nearly impossible. Charles, in turn, saw William's courage, intelligence, and unwavering loyalty despite the terrible price it demanded. Court physicians who treated whipping boys noted peculiar patterns in their injuries and behavior. Dr. Theodore Mayerne, physician to King James I, wrote in his private journals about treating young William Murray for what we would now recognize as symptoms of severe trauma: nightmares, sudden fits of trembling, an inability to eat before lessons, and a tendency to flinch at unexpected sounds. Yet these same physicians prescribed continued beatings as necessary medicine for the prince's moral development, unable or unwilling to see the contradiction in their approach. The social dynamics within the court created additional layers of complexity for whipping boys. Other courtiers' children viewed them with a mixture of envy and pity. Envy for their proximity to royal power, pity for the price they paid for it. Adult courtiers were careful in their interactions with whipping boys, recognizing that these children might someday wield considerable influence over the king. This created a strange inversion of normal childhood, where William might find himself being courted by powerful nobles while simultaneously being beaten like a common criminal. The religious instruction that accompanied the system added another dimension of psychological torture. Court chaplains would visit William after particularly severe beatings to remind him that his suffering served God's plan for the realm. They spoke of Christ's sacrifice and the virtue of accepting pain for others, weaving theological justifications around what was fundamentally child abuse. These sessions were intended to provide comfort and meaning, but they often left William more confused about his place in the world and the nature of divine justice. As the boys grew older, the system began to reveal its ultimate failure. Rather than creating a more disciplined prince, the whipping boy system often produced rulers who were either traumatized by guilt or indifferent to others' suffering. Charles I, who would later lose his head in the English Civil War, never fully developed the empathy his educators hoped the system would instill. Instead, he seemed to internalize the lesson that others should suffer for his mistakes, a mindset that would prove catastrophic for his reign. The most devastating aspect of the whipping boy system wasn't the physical abuse. It was how completely it failed to achieve its stated purpose while destroying the lives of the children it consumed. Historical records show that princes who grew up with whipping boys were no more disciplined, morale, or effective as rulers than those raised through conventional methods. In fact, many displayed disturbing psychological traits that can be directly traced to their traumatic educational experiences. Charles I's relationship with William Murray provides a perfect case study in the system's failure. Rather than learning empathy through his companion's suffering, Charles developed a detached view of other people's pain that would characterize his entire reign. When he became king, he showed the same indifference to his subjects' suffering that he'd been forced to display during William's beatings. The civil war that ultimately cost him his throne was partly rooted in his inability to understand or care about the consequences of his actions on ordinary people. The whipping boys themselves often suffered lifelong psychological damage that medieval medicine had no capacity to understand or treat. Many developed what modern psychologists would recognize as complex PTSD, depression, and anxiety disorders. Their adult lives were frequently marked by an inability to form healthy relationships, chronic health problems related to their childhood injuries, and a persistent sense of worthlessness despite their elevated social positions. Ironically, some whipping boys achieved significant power and influence in adulthood precisely because of their unique relationships with kings. William Murray became the first Earl of Dysart and remained one of Charles I's closest advisors throughout his reign. Yet even this success came at a terrible psychological cost. Murray spent his adult life serving a man whose affection for him was forever tainted by shared memories of violence and trauma. The system also revealed the profound moral bankruptcy of divine right monarchy. By declaring royal children literally untouchable, the system created a class of human beings who could commit any transgression without consequence, while others absorbed the punishment. This wasn't just cruel to the whipping boys, it was catastrophically poor preparation for rulership. Kings who had never experienced consequences for their actions inevitably became tyrants who couldn't understand why their subjects resented their rule. Perhaps most tragically, many whipping boys never recognized themselves as victims. The religious and cultural indoctrination was so complete that they often viewed their suffering as noble sacrifice rather than systematic abuse. This internalized justification allowed the system to perpetuate itself across generations, as former whipping boys sometimes recommended the practice for future royal children, unable to acknowledge the trauma they'd experienced. The gradual abandonment of the whipping boy system in the late 17th and early 18th centuries wasn't due to moral enlightenment about child welfare. It was because courts began to realize it didn't work. Kings educated through this method were proving to be ineffective rulers whose reigns were marked by civil wars, rebellions, and political instability. The supposed divine wisdom of the system was finally overwhelmed by its practical failures. Modern historians have traced direct connections between the psychological damage inflicted by whipping boy systems and some of the most catastrophic political decisions in European history. The emotional detachment and inflated sense of entitlement fostered by these educational methods contributed to the political instability that eventually brought down several European monarchies. The story of the royal whipping boy stands as one of history's most chilling examples of how absolute power corrupts not just those who wield it, but the entire society that enables it. These children weren't victims of individual cruelty. They were sacrifices to a system that had elevated monarchy to such divine status that it lost all connection to human decency and common sense. Their tragedy reminds us that the most dangerous ideas are often those wrapped in noble rhetoric and ancient tradition. The whipping boy system was justified through elaborate theological arguments and presented as serving the greater good of the realm. Yet beneath all the philosophical complexity lay a simple truth. Adults were torturing children to avoid the inconvenience of disciplining a spoiled prince. What makes this history particularly haunting is how completely the whipping boys have been erased from popular memory. We remember the kings and queens, the battles and treaties, the grand sweep of political change. But we've forgotten the broken children whose suffering made it all possible, whose small bodies absorbed the violence that their societies were too corrupted by power to direct where it belonged. The whipping boy system finally teaches us something profound about the nature of justice and human dignity. No child should suffer for another's mistakes, regardless of birth, breeding, or divine appointment. No system that requires the sacrifice of innocent lives for the education of the privileged can ever be morally justified, no matter how eloquently its defenders argue otherwise. These forgotten children paid the ultimate price for their society's failure to recognize the fundamental truth that all human beings, regardless of their station, deserve protection from violence and exploitation. Their memory challenges us to examine our own systems of power and privilege, to ask ourselves what suffering we're willing to ignore in service of maintaining social order, and to remember that true civilization is measured not by the grandeur of its palaces, but by how it treats its most vulnerable members.